Middle class values and sensibilities have informed the happiest years of our national history. Economically, the post World War II years, these were arguably the best 3 decades in terms of collective standard of living, general hope for the future. Children born in these years, the post World War II years, knew their lives held great promise. And the American dream was more than just a cliche. It meant a world that they were born into of ever increasing prosperity, a world of promise and hope. Our greatest strength resided in this collective shared experience of what it meant to be middle class in America. And because the middle class was created and had grown so numerous and so strong, democracy itself was unassailable while this middle class was dominant and ascendant in our society, in this republic. Now, where did the middle class come from? The Union movement created the middle class. The Wagner Act, 1935, made, for all intents and purposes, made unions legal, made it possible for them to operate freely. If you go back just a generation before, barely, before World War I, say 1910, 10% of the country controlled 70% of all wealth. And this 10% lived a very prosperous, comfortable life, while 90% of citizens controlled the remaining 30% of wealth. And most of these people lived a kind of a dollar a day lifestyle existence that really, if you wanted to replicate it or look for it today, you could only find it in the poorest third world nations in the 21st century. We're talking about a hardship, in 1900 of long hours, starvation wages, child labor, deadly conditions. For the bottom half of the workforce, this was the norm in many of these industries. Now, the owners of these mines and factories had co-opted the politicians with political contributions, and they had, in effect, ensured a mass migration, mass immigration of low-skilled workers. And this gave the owners a free hand to use, this political power that they wielded through their wallet, in essence. It gave them a free hand to use intimidation, and at times, even, they would form private armies, and they would have private detectives who were basically no more than hit squads who would go out and assault and even kill union organizers and any of these workers who might oppose them that were trying to organize the workers. So this was an incredible struggle over generations, probably 100 years. The full story of the labor movement is, I'm sure for the most part, lost to history because these were the little people struggling for their piece of the pie. Now, the Wagner Act of 1935, the Immigration Act of 1924 that slammed the door on this mass immigration from Southern and Eastern Europe, and World War II, these three factors changed the economic destiny of the nation. And it created a different world in the 19th century than the year 1900. The American middle class evolved out of these three factors: the Wagner Act of 1935 that normalized unions, the Immigration Act of 1924 that in essence shut the door and allowed us to assimilate this greatest mass immigration wave. It's been matched and then eclipsed by this latest wave, but before that, the nation had never seen anything like it. So there was a huge pushback, and eventually, out of that grassroots pushback, became the Immigration Act of 1924, and finally World War II. These three factors changed the economic destiny not just of the United States but of the world, and gave it a completely different complexion than the world of 1900, the economic world. So much so that from the end of World War II, 1945, until 1980, the world was transformed. In 1980, when Ronald Reagan became president, America was the largest manufacturing nation that this world had ever seen. And because we were this manufacturing powerhouse, we were the most wealthy nation in the world. We led the world in the manufacture of and export of value-added manufactured goods. Now, all through history, you see when a country loses a war, like say Rome versus Egypt, then the country that loses becomes a vassal state, and they supply the victor with agricultural products and um, timber and mineral wealth, uh, precious metals, but they do not become a manufacturing exporter on purpose. This is to keep them poor and keep them as a satellite vassal nation. So when you see an economic and manufacturing powerhouse, a nation that exports, creates value-added goods, what you're seeing is the winner, is the world's or the region's winner. Now, that was us, from 1945 to 1980. And it was this manufacturing base was the engine of our wealth creation. We had invented the modern age. Arguably, I mean, it really hit boost phase about the time of Edison, of course, but we'd invented this modern age. And so we manufactured the TVs, we manufactured the stereos and the household appliances and the automobiles and the airplanes and the phones and even the electric turbines to use to power it all. We invented all of this stuff. And so we were manufacturing this stuff that we had invented. We were the source of the modern age. And we brought this modern age to the world, literally. And this what made the United States so ascendant and so unassailable. Now, why is industrial manufacturing so important to the ultimate destiny of the United States? Well, first of all, without a manufacturing base, there will be no technological innovation. And any nation that loses the technological edge over its adversaries will also lose the arms race. And all of human history is, in effect, an arms race. So if you lose the arms race, the technological edge, you will be supplanted by another power. One example in history was in the late 1600s, England and France and Spain were basically, had been in a long war for basically for supremacy of the earth, certainly of Europe, arguably of the earth, for world domination. One of the three was going to come out on top, but it was never clear exactly which power. In the late 1600s, the sailors could always tell how far north or south they were on the earth, the latitude, how close they were to the equator, etc. But they had to guess how far they had traveled from east to west, the longitude. So if you're starting out in Europe and you're heading to the Americas, South America or North America, you know where you are north to south, but east to west, you have to guess exactly how far west you've come. Great Britain offered a huge monetary prize to the scientists that could solve the navigation problem, this, longitudinal problem. And there were all kinds of wild theories. And okay, so eventually a guy named John Harrison, a clockmaker, perfected a clock, a marine chronometer, that would allow exact navigation. And his top secret invention was carried on British warships. And this allowed the captain to know his exact location on the Earth's surface at all times, while their adversaries, the French or the Spanish navies, were forced to work with rough estimates. They never knew exactly, to the mile where they were. They had to guess. Now, if Great Britain had outsourced the manufacture of clocks, then this guy, John Harrison, the clockmaker, a self-taught clockmaker, he had spent literally a generation perfecting this invention. So his expertise garnered over years and years of his life, and then his sheer determination over several decades to perfect this device. It gave Britain an incredible advantage in this war for supremacy, not just of Europe, but of planet Earth. If Great Britain had outsourced the manufacture of clocks, then John Harrison would not have been a clockmaker. He would not have invented the marine chronometer, and the British Navy would not have had the upper hand over their adversaries. Great Britain could very well might not have. We have to speculate. They might not have prevailed over France and Spain. Today clocks are no longer. There's not a single clockmaker that 100% made in the USA. They're all imported, or at least the components in there. There's one that assembles components here. Now, we don't necessarily need clockmakers to give us an advantage over adversaries, but there are many, many other more technologically important products like communications, computers, aviation. We have lost these or are slowly losing these manufacturing base that will help us maintain this technological advantage. It is slipping away very rapidly. Okay, so there's the technological edge, and then there's the sheer brute force of a manufacturing base. In World War II, the Pacific Theater, this was a desperate battle between the United States and the Japanese naval fleets and air forces. I mean, this was a fight for survival. Either they were going to wipe us out, or we were going to wipe them out. Now, you know, very few people were alive and engaged in this war, or that were there are still here. If you're 105 or 110, sure, but this war is passing from living human memory. But the annals of this war have been recorded, and the sheer ferocity of this war has been forgotten by people like me and you who never experienced it, certainly. But it must be remembered what happened to people that the Japanese did conquer. Uh, there were massacres of entire cities, literally of hundreds of thousands of innocent civilians. The Japanese army would receive an order from its generals that are occupying a country in a city. They would receive an order, this is no exaggeration: burn all, rape all, kill all. Now, it's hard for us in the 21st century to imagine a war prosecuted in this manner, but this is the historic manner that all wars have been prosecuted as. We're so used to being sold war as a surgical, clean, and even humane operation that avoids collateral damage and civilian casualties. Well, this is just a means of making it more palatable to a public that wants to see themselves as having their hands clean. But war is another operation entirely. And if the Japanese had won World War II in the Pacific, essentially they would have done to us what they did to the Chinese, what they did to the Filipinos, what they did to the Koreans. They would have killed half the men and raped all the women. Now, this is very upsetting to hear, and it's not said for effect. This is to kind of get you back in touch with the real meaning of what war is. We live in a bubble. We live in a bubble of a society that is trying to become more and more sensitive, more and more just, more and more perfect. But this is not how the world is. The world is not fair. The world is not just. The world is not kind. The world is what it has always been. We are just in a kind of bubble. And unless you have a passport and go around the world, you really don't understand just how much of a bubble we really live in the 21st century, we in the West, and how difficult human life can be outside of this bubble of the rule of law. So I don't say these things lightly. It's important to learn these lessons so you don't have to learn them the hard way. World War II was a desperate struggle for survival and nothing less. And that generation understood these things, that it was us or them. Our incredible industrial manufacturing base of 1942 allowed us to sustain material losses and replace them. At the same time, we were able to continue to expand our Pacific fleet, to keep building and adding to it, while Japan was sustaining similar losses, certainly in the first year. And yet they could not sustain these losses and replace them, much less continue to expand, because they did not have the same manufacturing capability that we did. So this continued for 3.5 years. By the end of World War II in the Pacific in 1945, we had 100 aircraft carriers, having started with only 7. Now, prior to World War II, Americans criticized, business interests for supplying Japan with oil and supplying Japan with steel in the form of scrap metal, and that they were openly using to create an immense naval force. And this naval fleet was going to be used to challenge the United States for supremacy in the Pacific, certainly in the Western Pacific. Well, today we see similar voices criticize our politicians and business elites because economically and even politically, they have climbed into bed with the Chinese. Certainly the business elite has, without doubt. They are helping China grow rich and build a vast military machine that is expanding exponentially. We are losing our technological edge, and we are losing our manufacturing base. And we need to maintain these, both the brute strength of our manufacturing capacity, as well as the technological edge, the innovation that comes from these strategic technologies. In 1600, a strategic technology obviously was clockmaking. Now, of course, that's not true anymore, but communications, computers, and similar technologies, these are the modicum in war of victory or defeat. And I would argue that just because we wage war in an incremental and judicious, humane fashion as possible, this does not mean that this is what we will confront in the future. Just because we're nice, we think everyone's going to like us. This is a mistake. This is a fallacy. And this needs to be revisited. We need our manufacturing base to survive, for democracy to survive, for the American peace to be maintained, not just in the Western Pacific, but across the face of the globe. We need to stiffen the resolve of our allies and to renew our determination to increase our national wealth and to rebuild the middle class of this nation, first and foremost.